Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing great. Today, we're gonna go over how mono-red decks can deal with enchantments. While there are a number of things that mono-red really struggles with, dealing with enchantments is probably on top of that list. And spoiler alert, there isn't a whole lot of great options to remove enchantments efficiently in mono-red. However, don't worry. We'll also be going a little bit beyond just removals to see what we can do against enchantments. So, I'm hoping that by watching this, you'll be better prepared when facing all those nasty enchantments out there. So, first and most importantly, before I go into any specific cards at all, I should mention that instead of worrying about the problematic enchantments, oftentimes the best play is to simply go for the player instead. In other words, player removal. And luckily, this is something that mono-red is usually very well equipped to do. And extending this idea a little bit further, you can also simply apply some pressure on whoever is playing troublesome enchantments, without necessarily needing to kill them. So the extreme example here would be, for example, say someone playing a full enchantment decks like Goshintai, which most likely has all sorts of enchantments that you'll be struggling against. But keeping them at a low life total means that removing them from the game will be within reach once they put down whatever troublesome enchantment they have. And I also have one more tip at the end on how to deal with enchantments without using removal cards. But for now, let's jump into some cards. So first, let's go over the staples. And when I say staples, there are really only like two of them. And one of which we just got very recently from the Baldur's Gate set. Let's go over them really quickly. First, we have Chaos Warp. At 2 and a red, instant. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent, they put it onto the battlefield. So this hits any permanent, and it goes through indestructible. And while opponent does get to flip a permanent from the top of their library, it's usually okay more often than not. Note that they can hit lands, and they can't even completely whiff if they hit a non-permanent card. So overall, this is probably the best option that red has. So next we have Wild Magic Surge. It costs red, it's an instant, and it says destroy target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a permanent card that shares a card type with that permanent. They put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of their library in a random order. So, unlike Chaos Warp Tug effect, this is a destroy effect. So it can be less ideal against graveyard recursion and indestructible effects. I remember once having to remove an opponent's Perforos, but couldn't do it with this. But other than those caveats, it's really a God-given gift as the red removal. It's versatile, it can hit any type of permanents, and the downside is similar but a bit worse than Chaos Warp. Your opponent does get to flip until they find a permanent with the same type that was destroyed. So yeah, if you get rid of an enchantment, there's a good chance another will pop out. That said, if you get rid of the scariest and problematic enchantment at the time, there's a good chance that the new one will be less scary. Next, let's move on to Tybalt's Trickery. It costs 1 and a red, it's an instant, and it says counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles card from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in random order. So I thought I should add this in this section. It's not really a permanent removal, but it interacts on the stack, which might be even better. And again, like the others, opponent gets to put a new thing onto the battlefield. But assuming you're countering their Venus enchantment again, you should do this only if you really need to. then you should be good most of the time. And finally, we have Chaotic Transformation. It costs 5 and a red. It's a sorcery. It says exile up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target planeswalker, and up to 1 target land. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it, puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles. So, while this is not a staple, I thought this fits in with all the sort of polymorph effects that the other cards have in this list. So, why is this not exactly a staple? Probably because it costs 6. That said, it does hit multiple targets of different types, which can provide so much value. And you can even polymorph your own stuff, especially if your deck is built around it with in mind. So the next category is the generic colorless cards. These are typically super versatile but somewhat overcosted cards. These are cards that can be played in any deck because they're colorless, and on top of that they can also deal with any permanent types. That's probably why I see these getting mentioned a lot on Reddit and Magic forums. However, while they're versatile in different ways, they are extremely expensive mana-wise. Personally, I'm not really a fan of these. I think most of these are unplayable at even mid to high power tables. So first we have Introduction to Annihilation. It costs 5 colorless, and it says exile target non-land permanent. Its controller draws a card, and it's a sorcery. So first, this one is the cheapest in this category. And at 5 mana, probably actually not that bad. And it exiles. The obvious downside here is that opponent gets to draw a card, which I think is completely fine. They get to draw a card, whatever, right? One thing is that it also doesn't hit lands. And the biggest downside in my opinion is that it's sorcery speed. At lower power table with less interaction, this might be okay, but otherwise it's just too slow and can be really clunky at times. Next we have Ugin, the Ineffable. Costs 6 colorless. It's a legendary planeswalker. It has a static ability that says colorless spells you cast cost 2 colorless last to cast. So that's really nice. And the +1 ability is exile the top card of your library face down and look at it. Create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. When that token leaves the battlefield, put the exile card into your hand. And the second ability, which is the one that's more relevant here, is -3, destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. And Ugin here starts with 4 loyalty counters at the beginning. So out of all in this category, this one is probably the one I'd consider playing if it fits in the deck. And while removal at 6 is pretty expensive, it offers a lot more. Like just the passive ability alone offers a lot of value if we can utilize it. And the +1 is actually also a form of card advantage, which is hard to come by in red. So yeah, there's a lot of potential upside, especially if it sticks around. And worst case, it makes your opponent spend some resources to take this down, because Ugin will still live after you use the -3 to destroy target permanent. And next we have Ugin the Spirit Dragon. So this one is Ugin also, but it's the bigger Ugin. It costs 8. It's a legendary planeswalker. Starts with 7 loyalty counter. It has 3 abilities. First one is +2. Ugin the Spirit Dragon deals 3 damage to target creature or player, so removal. Next one is -X. Exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less that's 1 or more colors. So this is the one that we're interested in to remove enchantments. And the last one, the ultimate, is -10. You gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, then put up to 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. So at 8 mana, you better have more than just enchantment removal for this card in mind, right? And for a removal piece slot, 8 mana is just way too much. But that said, this is a card that can turn the game around and gain a lot of value, especially if your deck synergizes well with it. Say you play mono red with a lot of colorless artifact. The -X removal can hit enchantment and a lot more. And the first ability is pretty nice too, because it is also removal. Next we have Scar from Existence. It costs 7 colorless mana. It's an instant. It simply says exile target permanent. So this is sort of the instant version of Introduction to Annihilation that hits anything. It can even hit land. So super versatile, but at 7 mana though, oof. I think player removal might be more efficient at this point. Next we have Spine of Isha and Meteor Golem. I put these two together because they're very similar. They're removal in the form of permanent. So I'm gonna read each of them really quick here. Spine of Isha costs 7. It's an artifact. When Spine of Isha enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. And when Spine of Isha is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return Spine of Isha to its owner's hand. So it is easily recurable by default. Next we have Meteor Golem, also costs 7 colorless. It's an artifact creature of type Golem. When Meteor Golem enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls, and it's a 3/3. So these two are, yeah, as I said earlier, they're super similar. They're permanent, which means they're more easily recurable. And while you might get more use out of them with repeated use, it's still a pretty hefty cost at 7. I can see them playable with decks that can cheat them in somehow, but otherwise, I'd probably pass on them. So most of the time, I wouldn't consider these cards in the generic colorless versatile category at all. I really rather allocate more cards to more effectively kill off my opponents, or probably invest some card slots for alternative win cons, in case my primary win con gets shut down by some enchantment piece. So in this next category, we have some cards that, in contrast to the previous group, is more well costed but have a much narrower use case. These usually have a pretty tight restriction in what they can hit. So first we have Blast Zone. It's a land. And it says Blast Zone enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. It has 3 abilities. First is tap to add a colorless. Second is pay XX and tap it to put X charge counters on Blast Zone. And finally, pay 3 colorless, tap it, sacrifice Blast Zone to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. Yeah, best part about this is that it's a land that still produces the colorless. And it doesn't enter the battlefield tap like a lot of utility land does. So yeah, it does need to be charged to hit higher CMC cards, but the nice thing is that you don't have to pay all this mana all at once. You can add counters over time with any unused mana you have. And because Blast Zone comes with a free charge counter on it, you can blow up 1 CMC enchantments without needing to charge it up. There probably aren't too many 1 CMC enchantments that you really want to blow up, but on top of my head, this will hit things like Mystic Remora, Deafening Silence, Exploration, and other things. So you can really slow down your opponent with this. And finally, just be careful with this, because while it will hit a lot of other permanent types aside from enchantments, it will hit your stuff too. So tread carefully. Next, we have Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. So these are pretty much the same. They cost 1 red, are an instant, and it says choose one. Counter target blue spell or destroy target blue permanent. So these are hyper efficient but only hits blue. It probably plays better on higher power tables with more blues. But yeah, I think these are absolute staples in like CEDH. In lower power metas, however, probably including 1 is still okay, since the chance of there being blue on the table is not that low. These do also hit 2 of probably the best cards in EDH, which are Mystic Remora and Rhystic Studies. And although being mono red makes us care less about things like back to basics, it's still a nice target if it blocks us from, let's say, activating our Nykthos. And finally, since it does have the 2 modes, both counter target blue spell and destroy target blue permanent, we can interact both on the stack and on the battlefield, which gives us a lot of versatility. Next, we have Ratchet Bomb. Ratchet Bomb costs 2 colorless. It's an artifact. First ability, tap to put a charge counter on Ratchet Bomb. Next, tap and sacrifice Ratchet Bomb to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Ratchet Bomb. So this is the artifact version of Blast Zone, or actually probably Blast Zone is the land version of this card. And this one, it costs 2. So that's sort of the upfront cost. But adding counters after that only requires tapping. So no further mana investment. So in a way, this is more efficient. And same as Blast Zone, it blows up other stuff too, not just enchantments. So again, be careful when playing this. Next, we have Direfleet Daredevil, which costs 1 colorless and a red. It's a creature, human pirate. It has first strike, and it says when Direfleet Daredevil enters the battlefield, exile target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard. You may cast it this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast that spell. If that spell would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So yeah, this one is interesting. It does, however, rely on your opponent having played an enchantment removal. So not exactly the most reliable thing out there. One nice thing is that this is a creature, so it makes the effect more easily recurable. But remember, the total cost will not just be 1 colorless and red. It will be 1 colorless, red, and whatever the enchantment removal costs. So in the end, it's really not that efficient. And last, we have Liquid Metal Torque combined with Artifact Removal. Liquid Metal Torque costs 2 colorless. It's an artifact. It has 2 abilities. First one, tap to add 1 colorless, and second one, tap to make target non-land permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. So while I do think it's a cool synergy and it's pretty sweet when it works, I do find it a bit overrated. It requires you to have 2 cards, and the Liquid Metal Torque and an artifact removal. And while it's nice to be like a backup or nice to have removal option, this probably shouldn't be counted towards filling a dedicated removal slot. The next category is the nuclear option. And I must say I don't really recommend this, but again, if it fits with your overall strategy somehow, then nice. Let's get rid of those enchantments while going on with our plan. First, we have Nevinyrral's Disc. Costs 4 colorless, it's an artifact. Nevinyrral's Disc enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 1 colorless, tap it to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So probably the most playable out of the bunch in this category. It's only 4 mana, and although you have to wait for another turn, it has instant speed activation. So after that untap, you can pretty much threaten to activate this anytime. And this effect will also discourage opponents from playing their problematic enchantment at all. So it's also a good deterrent. Then last we have All Is Dust. For 7 colorless, it's a sorcery. It says each player sacrifices all colored permanents they control. So this can actually be a really nice one-sided board wipe if you're leaning into colorless or artifacts. But still, if the goal is to deal with enchantments, it's a pretty steep mana cost. Alright, and last we have a couple of unconventional cards that can deal with enchantments. I think these are not mentioned as often and probably have a harder way in fitting into decks. But if it happens to place well with your deck, then they might be worth looking at. So first we have Frenzied Fugue. It costs 3 colorless and a red. It's an aura. It says enchant permanent. When Frenzied Fugue enters the battlefield or at the beginning of your upkeep, gain control of enchanted permanent until end of turn. Untap that permanent, it gains haste until end of turn. So with this, you can gain control of an opponent's permanent during your turn, which I think oftentimes is enough for what we need when it comes to dealing with enchantments. A lot of the problematic enchantments are the one that prevents us from executing our win strategy. For mono red, go white decks, this could be Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, or even things like Solitary Confinement. If we steal those during our turn when we attack, problem solved. And remember, this can hit any permanent types. So if there's a Blightsteel on the opposite side, yeah, we can grab that too. And at 4 mana, well, it's not super effective, but I think it can at least enable some fun playlines. The second card in this unconventional category is Confusion in the Ranks. Confusion in the Ranks costs 3 colorless, red. It's an enchantment itself. Whenever an artifact, creature, or enchantment comes into play, its controller chooses target permanent another player controls that shares a type with it. Exchange control of those permanents. So, if you're playing Chaos, then this is probably already in your deck and you're an evil person. Just kidding. So, one thing that's not immediately obvious with this card is that it triggers itself when entering the battlefield. So yeah, you can play this and immediately exchange it with whatever problematic enchantment there is, let's say Solitary Confinement, and then boom, you go for the kill. That said, yeah, that Solitary Confinement will probably go somewhere else very soon because more exchanges will happen, or who knows what will happen. It's chaos, right? So before ending this, I do want to reiterate other ways to deal with enchantments, which often can be more effective than just jamming in more clunky enchantment removal pieces to your deck. So first, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is player removal. Remember, you might not be able to remove an enchantment, but you can still remove the player, which then get rid of their enchantments. So if someone plays an enchantment deck or simply has a lot of problematic enchantments in their deck that you cannot deal with, try eliminate that player first, or at least put enough pressure so you can finish them easily when needed. Second, and I really think this is something that deserves more attention when it comes to deck building in general, consider adding alternative win conditions. With alternative win cons, if certain enchantments locks you out of one of your win cons, you will still have other ways out. So I'll use a few examples from one of my own mono red deck. I play a Grenzo Havoc Razor deck, which has the primary win con of simply going white with a lot of creatures and kill my opponents through combat. However, pillow fort pieces, especially enchantment ones, are very problematic for decks like this. Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, Sphere of Safety, you name it. All of these makes my attack pretty useless. So if too many of these effects are in the game, I need to switch my game plan. And one of example here is I will switch from going white in combat to, let's say, Perforos, which I have in my deck. I will spend my resources protecting Perforos and playing cards that triggers Perforos' ability. If Perforos doesn't work for some reason, let's say perhaps it got removed, I do have another trick that will that still synergizes with my deck. Strixhaven Stadium. With Strixhaven Stadium, I can still get counters by attacking other opponents, and I will only need to do combat damage one time to the enchantment player in order to get them out of the game once I have enough counters on my Strixhaven Stadium. And let's see, what about things like Solitary Confinement? This one is a lot trickier for my deck to deal with because it just prevents damage to the player. But luckily, I'm not completely locked out of the game. For this, I'll probably rely on the one card that can save me here, which is Throne of the God Pharaoh. Again, this card still synergizes with my go white strategy, but for this specific scenario, it's a lifesaver. Throne of the God Pharaoh effect is lost life, so it does get around damage prevention. So even though my 10 tokens might not deal any damage to that player, Throne of the God Pharaoh ensures that everyone will lose 10 life at the end of my turn. So there you go. A hopefully decent enough list to deal with enchantments in mono red. I really hope this helps you with your deck building. And if I miss anything important, or if you have other ideas about dealing with enchantments in mono red, or if you have any question at all, please share with everyone in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe and like if you find this useful. It helps me know whether I should make more videos like this or not in the future. With that, thanks for watching and have fun brewing, guys.